Hi everyone, and welcome to your lecture on sociality in birds. My name is Leanne, and I'm a postdoc at McMaster University in Dr. Pruitt's lab. Since most of you probably have never met me, I thought I would just start the lecture by introducing myself to you, so you have a little bit of idea about my background and what my research is. So I primarily work with birds, which is why I'm giving this lecture. I'm primarily a field biologist. I've worked with a variety of species, but I primarily am interested in avian behavior and communication. I've studied birds' vocal communication, and more recently, I study their chemical communication. So I'm interested in how birds are using smell in their social and mate choice communication in particular. So when I'm not out in the field having all kinds of fun, you can find me or my students in the lab where I use genetics, bioinformatics, microbial genetics, and gas chromatography approaches to answer questions like what kind of information is available in birds' body odors, and then how do they use that information, as I mentioned, socially and in mate choice contexts. So that's a little bit of background on me. And I've got my email address at the end of the lecture, so if at any point you have questions, you can always email me later, and I can hopefully clarify for you. So birds are an extremely well-studied taxonomic group. This is partly, I think, because we're so fascinated and inspired by their ability to fly, and also because we're attracted to their bright colors and their complex, beautiful songs. But birds are also a really great system where we can study cooperative group living or sociality. So in birds, we can find examples from across the social spectrum, from relatively non-social and solitary species, like the greater roadrunner, all the way to birds that gather in groups for protection against predators, like red-winged blackbirds or other colonial birds. We can find birds that that forage together to capitalize on food resources, like these evening grosbeak. And at the more extreme end of sociality, we can find birds like these white-winged chaws that cooperatively breed. And these birds are obligate cooperative breeders that cannot successfully raise young unless they are in a breeding group of more than 2 individuals. And I'll talk more about that in particular later. So why would birds be social? Given that it's nearing the end of term, you've probably covered a lot of possible reasons already in other taxonomic groups. So hopefully this will be a little bit of a review for you. So birds will cooperate to find and obtain food, like these cedar waxwings that are picking fruit off of a fall tree. Birds can use cooperation and group behaviors like mobbing to avoid and deter predators, as seen in the image here where these 2 American crows are attacking a red-tailed hawk that could be hunting them, or more likely their nestlings or eggs at the nest. Birds can use social behaviors to save energy when they're flying, and this is something I'll talk about again in a little more detail later. And finally, birds can cooperate to obtain mates. In this example, these are a tropical bird known as the swallowtail manakin. And in this system, multiple males perform a courtship dance, and without multiple males performing the dance, the female will not mate at all. And so the alpha male, the one jumping up in the air to impress the green colored female, is the only male typically that will secure breeding with that female, but he requires those beta or subordinate males to help him with his dance. That's a bit of a teaser for you. I don't have time to cover that social system in this lecture, but you can always look up swallow-tailed mannequins if you're curious about that dance, and there's cool videos on the internet too. So another reason that birds are social is because they often form these pair bonds between breeding males and females. Two birds interacting together is itself a form of sociality. And in many bird species, males and females are often required for successful rearing of the young. So in these examples here, I'm showing breeding systems with biparental care, where both males and females help to raise the young. And in some species, this is required, again, for successful breeding. So there's some life history strategies as well as some ecological features that contribute to sociality in birds. So what are the benefits of sociality? I've already introduced some of them. In the first example I gave, birds like these crossbills and these grosbeak are foraging together in these flocks in order to capitalize on food resources. So these kinds of species might travel even great distances to follow a food source. They might sort of help each other determine where the good food sources are or where food sources have already been depleted, traveling together as a group. And this can also help provide some protection against predators as well. Another way that birds can be social is through colonial behavior. This is often seen in breeding, shown in the penguin and flamingo examples on the left. But you can also find this in birds when they're flocking. And birds might flock in single species groups, like the starlings on the bottom in that wacky looking murmuration. But you can also find mixed species flocks, like the blackbirds there, which includes redwings and cowbirds. And so it can be difficult for predators to actually successfully get at any individual in these large and complex groups. So here's an example of sociality. Forgive the cheesy music.
Nature and wildlife give us clues on how we can live in harmony with others. A bird species known as sociable weavers are known to create massive, visually appealing nests in the Kalahari Desert in South Africa. The nests resemble haystacks, and they are comprised of twigs, straw, grass, and other natural elements. The insides are covered in cotton, fur, or other soft material that the birds can find. Owls, eagles, and of course the builders themselves, weavers, inhabit the nests. Surprisingly, they are safe from tree snakes or cobras, and the temperature inside remains cool during the day and warm at night, defying the harsh desert climate. The sociable weaver is about the size of a sparrow, usually weighing approximately an ounce. They are brown with a scale-like appearance and have a black patch on their throats. Some of the nests house up to 100 families of sociable weavers, and they can be occupied for a century.
So in that example, obviously the species is known as a sociable weaver because it is so social. One thing I just wanted to clarify, they mentioned that those basket-like nests could be used by owls and other species. And that would be typically after the colony has dispersed or if part of the colony is vacant. So the benefit of having that dense, massive group nesting structure is that mostly predators are not able to successfully attack and kill eggs, young, and the adults themselves. And so here's another video I have showing an example of how difficult it can be for predators to attack flocking species like these starlings. So this is a coordinated group flight known as a murmuration. And there's the peregrine up top. It's not the best video quality, unfortunately. You can see how all of the birds move together without colliding into one another, which is some really complex physics involved in that. So there you'll see the peregrine again, moving through the flock, making another attack, and the flock moves again. The peregrine comes around for another pass, And ultimately, the peregrine is not able to catch a single bird from this flock. Another reason that birds can live and travel in groups is to help them save energy. Currently, over the past few weeks, you've likely all seen Canada geese flying in their classic V formation, and other species of birds will do this as well. And the reason they do this is to save energy during flight. So when they take this staggered approach, the bird in front, the lead bird, creates a downdraft of wind, and that can create this upwash for the bird that's just in behind, where there's a lower amount of wind and lower pressure, making it easier for that bird to fly. And this has been demonstrated in experimental studies as well, and it's something that we humans do as well. Like cyclists in a race will often take the same kind of staggered approach to get that small benefit of receiving the upwash from the lead bird. And in geese and other birds that fly this way, when the lead bird gets tired, it will simply move to the back of the line and another bird will take the lead for a period of time. Another benefit of sociality is to increase breeding success. So here I've shown examples of several different cooperatively breeding bird species. And this is a system where offspring receive care from both their parents and other members of their group that are not their parents. Cooperative breeding occurs in about 10% of bird species. There are about 10,000 species of birds in the world, and so this means that there are about 1,000 bird species that have cooperative breeding. They may not cooperatively breed all the time, or they may require cooperative breeding to even rear one single young. For example, the white-winged chaw that are obligate cooperative breeders. There are a variety of cooperative breeding systems, and I'll talk about two of them a little bit later in more detail. So going back to some of the benefits associated with traveling together as a group to seek food and to avoid predators, I wanted to talk a little bit more about mixed flocks. So a flock is a group of birds of a single species, like that starling murmuration, that travel together. But you can also see these mixed species flocks, and this is when you have groups of individuals from at least two species that travel together, typically in search of food. So here you see cardinals, white-throated sparrow, and a dark-eyed junco. Here you can see some siskin, pine siskin, an evening grosbeak, and some crossbills. Often in the winter, you'll see birds at feeders from a variety of species that are foraging all together quite peaceably in most cases. And especially in the winter, you can see a variety of species of ducks, geese, even gulls that will at least passively forage together. They may not travel together in groups, but they will occupy the same space. So this can increase feeding efficiency, particularly in these mixed species foraging flocks of songbirds, like the first three images. They can, as I mentioned earlier, sort of alert each other to solid, high quality food resources. This could be through actively communicating vocally about a food source or simply by eavesdropping. So when a flocking species sees other birds at a particular area, it may take that as a clue that there's food nearby and it can go and join the group. These are all seed-eating birds, but in the tropics, there are mixed species flocks of insectivore or insect-eating birds, and part of the benefit to being a flock is that they might help flush the invertebrate prey out ahead of them, and then everyone can go in and grab the food. So there's a few different ways that flocks can benefit. And as I mentioned earlier as well, traveling in a flock can decrease their predation risk. So there can be a simple dilution risk. The more birds there are, the lower the chance of any one individual being eaten or singled out by a predator. There's also a hypothesis called many eyes, where having more individuals that can be alert to predators means that the group is more likely to detect a predator in time to escape without being caught. They can reduce their risk of being encountered in the first place through that system, as well as reduce the risk of being killed. These flocks can also potentially confuse a predator. So much like that starling murmuration, it can be very difficult for a predator to single out and follow one individual when they're moving together, especially in such a tight group as the murmuration. So the main benefits of mixed flocks then could be summarized as an increased feeding efficiency and a decreased predation risk. There's also one species of bird known in the world that engages in cooperative hunting, and this species is the Harris's hawk. In the non-breeding season, you can have groups of 2 up to 6 individuals that will hunt cooperatively, and this increases their hunting success compared to when individuals attempt to hunt alone. And this is a really, really fascinating system. In this image on the top right, the birds actually will engage in this behavior. They're not getting ready to copulate, but in fact, the bird on top is stacking on the other one so that it can see a little bit farther. And you can even get multiple birds stacking on one another like circus performers so that they can see a little bit more. So they'll cooperatively view the predators, and then they have a whole sort of ritualized cooperative hunt behavior that they can change adaptively to successfully make a kill. So when a predator is spotted, either because the birds were stacking or just perched individually in trees scouting out, a single hawk will lead the pursuit. So it'll go out in front, and then often, much like coyotes, you can then have 2 other individuals that will flank that lead bird. And then if the predator, if the prey species, often a rabbit, takes a sharp turn, those flanking birds can go in and take over the lead chase. If the first hawk makes a dive at the predator, at the prey item, and misses, another one of the flanking birds will slide in and take its place in that way as well. If the prey item hides under a bush or something like that, some of the hawks will actually fly down onto the ground and rush into the bush to flush the prey out. Those birds won't be able to make the kill, but the other birds waiting nearby will be able to. And once they do make the kill, they will all share the food item. There's even situations that have been described where a prey item might dive into a burrow or nest underground, and hawks will actually block the prey in that case by sticking their feet into the hole or plugging the exit and then just guarding it until the animal that they're trying to kill comes out another entrance, or they just get exhausted and have to come up. So there's all kinds of really fascinating ways that these birds hunt together. And here I have a video of some birds that are captively kept and trained in falconry to hunt in this way that they do in the wild.
When it comes to hunting, most hawks like flying solo, except for the Harris's hawk. These desert raptors love being part of a crowd, especially when they move in for the kill. First, a scout takes the high ground, scanning the landscape with vision thought to be 8 times better than a human's. Then it's time to invite the relatives over for dinner. The first hawk spots the quarry, a jackrabbit. It won't be easy to catch. These hares wrote the book on evasive action. They can run as fast as 40 miles an hour and leap 10 feet. But it may take more than that to escape from the wolf pack of the air. The first hawk flushes the jackrabbit while the others watch for the getaway. When the rabbit instinctively zigzags away from one predator, it runs straight into the talons of another. And the whole family gets to share in the spoils, though there's always a little sibling rivalry. But the family that prays together will probably stay together, so long as they watch out for cactus thorns.
So I should apologize. I likely should have given a little warning that it's a bit of a graphic video. My apologies for not doing so sooner. But we can move on from predation to cooperative breeding. So I wanted to give you a little introduction to two different cooperative breeding systems. As I mentioned, there's more than two, but just in the interest of time, I'll give you a little bit more detail about these two. The first is what's known as a helper at the nest system. And here there's a dominant breeding pair as well as some number of helpers. And these helpers are often offspring of the dominant breeding pair from a prior year. So in a sort of more typical system of socially monogamous birds that have biparental care, typically when the male and female finish rearing the young and the young are ready to leave the nest or fledge, the young will disperse and they will move to a new territory, find their own mates in the following year, and then breed on their own, and the cycle continues. But in this system, often the offspring will not leave. They'll stick around with their parents even into the next breeding season. And instead of breeding themselves, they will help their parents raise the next set of offspring. There's many reasons why this system can unfold. Often it takes place because of resource limitations, so there may not be enough habitat for the offspring to disperse to, and so they may stay with the family group, helping to raise their own relatives until some breeding space opens up for them. And that can happen through a territory being abandoned nearby or elsewhere, one of their parents perhaps dying, or through other means. So in this example, I'm showing the acorn woodpecker. They occur in the southern, I believe, southwestern United States. And here you can have groups of up to 15 adult birds, including offspring from previous years, which would now be adults. The average group size, though, is typically around 4 or 5 birds. And as I mentioned, they'll all help raise the young. Both of the male and female dominant breeders will incubate the young, and the non-breeding helpers will also incubate, but to a lesser extent. They'll all feed as well, but again, it's the dominant breeding pair that tends to feed more, so they're doing more work, but they're getting that help from other group members, which again are typically, but not always, their offspring. And the fledgling success, so the number of birds that successfully leave the nest, tends to increase as the group size increases. So the larger the breeding group, as long as it's stable, the more offspring or the more young they're able to successfully fledge out of the nest. There are some other aspects of this breeding system that occur because you can have multiple breeding pairs within the same group, something that's called plural breeding. And you can have some situations where males will mate with multiple females and females will mate with multiple males. They do tricky little things like sneak eggs into other nests, or birds that aren't supposed to be breeding might sneak eggs into the breeding pair's nest as well. But the main point I wanted to make is that this helper at the nest system, characterized by kin groups, family groups with a dominant breeding pair and retained offspring who help raise their siblings, is one of the more common cooperative breeding systems that you can see. And this is because the individuals in the group who are not breeding can get benefits through kin selection because they're helping to raise their own relatives, full siblings, or maybe even half siblings in some cases. They'll still gain an inclusive fitness benefit because some of their genes will be passed on to the next generation by helping their family and their siblings. Another cooperative breeding system I want to talk about is joint nesting. This is a system where multiple socially monogamous male-female pairs come together to form a cooperatively breeding group, but these individuals aren't typically related. So this is not a helper at the nest system. You have multiple pairs of individuals that are breeding, and they all lay their eggs in a single nest. They all cooperate to raise the young, but they compete as well. So individual anis will toss eggs out of the nest if they're not their own eggs, and they'll bury eggs as well. So before an individual female starts laying her own eggs, she'll do this tossing and burying behavior. And so here, the birds can breed as a single pair, but they often breed as these cooperatively breeding groups of anywhere from 4 up to 18, almost 20 individuals. And in this system, actually, the larger the group gets, often the fewer offspring they're able to fledge, because the larger the group gets, the longer it takes them to synchronize their egg-laying behavior. And if they're not synchronized in their egg-laying behavior, if there's a mixture of females that are laying and who haven't started laying yet, those females that haven't started laying will continue tossing and burying eggs, and the amount of egg loss can actually be quite extraordinary. These groups can lay over 40 eggs in a single nest, and the majority of those eggs can be lost. Another aspect of this system that's quite interesting is that as that group size increases, if the group is not synchronous in the egg laying, the offspring might start to hatch at different times. So you'll get a mixture of very tiny, newly hatched young with much older, larger siblings. And those tiny little newly hatched young can actually get kind of squished or pushed out of the nest, or they just can't compete to get food. And so they might die. And then again, overall, the breeding success can decrease as the group size increases. This is a rather rare system. Of those roughly 10% of bird species that breed cooperatively, only 2% of those are joint nesters like this bird, the smooth-billed ani. And you might have noticed that there's a photo of me when I introduced myself with one of these birds perched on my head. And that's because I did my master's research with Dr. Jim Quinn in the Department of Biology here at McMaster, and I worked with smooth-billed anis in Puerto Rico for my master's research. Another, as I mentioned, these individuals are primarily unrelated. So this isn't really a kin system where relatives are helping each other, but it's worth pointing that within a breeding group, for example, the one shown here, individuals are more related. There's higher degree of relatedness than within the group than between groups. So these birds are territorial, and there will be multiple breeding groups within a given area. And so in this one breeding group, individuals might be about related on average about 20% of the time. And between groups, if this was a different breeding group on an adjacent territory, they would only be related between groups about 10% of the time. So within group relatedness, about 20%, between group relatedness, about 10%. So they may get a little bit of inclusive fitness if they're helping a relative, but that's not really enough to drive this system because they aren't very related like those whole families of acorn woodpeckers are. So when aren't birds social? Why wouldn't a bird be social if they can derive all of these benefits from sociality? Of course, there are costs of sociality as well. As we're all unfortunately too familiar with these days, we know that increasing density, increasing our number of associations and contacts and getting really close with one another increases our chance of contracting disease. That can be true of group living and colonial birds as well. It can even be true of those mixed species foraging flocks, especially if people don't clean their bird feeders. So do clean your bird feeders regularly. So disease is a major cost of sociality, but birds living in groups also have to compete for access to resources. In the case of these colonial nesting penguins, that could be access to nesting space, but it can also be access to food as well, either within the breeding colony or within a flock of birds that's stopping simply to forage. As well, even though I mentioned some of the benefits of flocks to help avoid and detect predators, there is risk associated with being in a flock as well, because it's easier for a predator to detect a huge flock than to detect a single individual. So that risk benefit situation with predation can go both ways. So again, I just want to show another video here highlighting successful predation in a flock. This time it's a flock of bats.
Deserts. Scorched, desolate.
It's quite dramatic.
But alive. One million bats, forced to leave the safety of their cave. For life. The sun is so powerful here, there's barely anything to it. The bats can only catch enough insects by leaving early. But in daylight, they're dangerously exposed. Hawks wait. In the desert, timing is everything.
So again, costs and benefits to being social. And just to recap in terms of costs, some of the main costs are disease, risk of exposure and infection increases as sociality and contacts increase. Competition for resources like access to food, habitat, mates, and mating sites. And predation risk can increase with group size because you may become more conspicuous to predators. So when does sociality evolve? When does sociality evolve? When the costs of sociality, oh, I've done that backwards. I'm so sorry. When the benefits of sociality are greater than the costs. That should be reversed. I apologize for that. Sociality evolves when the benefits of being social outweigh the costs to being social. So sociality tends to increase when predation risk increases. And this is typically because that benefit of being in a group, having many eyes to detect predators, having many individuals that can dilute that predation risk, many individuals in a flock that might confuse the predator and make it more difficult for them to successfully capture any one individual. When those benefits are often greater in a group than that cost of being more conspicuous is. So typically what we see is that sociality will increase, degree of association or group size or some other measure of sociality like colonial nesting will increase as predation risk increases. And it turns out that the more unpredictable and variable the environment is, the more likely sociality is to evolve. And I wanted to give an example of this going back to cooperative breeding birds in particular. As I mentioned with the smooth-billed awnies, they're not that related to each other, and yet they're in these cooperatively breeding groups, though they also compete. And so why should they do that if they're not really gaining a lot of benefit helping their kin, and we know in that system that they have a lot of habitat and breeding territory available. So they're not limited in terms of space or options. They're not forced to be in a group. And in fact, they don't even have to breed cooperatively. They are facultative cooperative breeders. They can raise young as a single pair, and they do better when they do so. So why would birds cooperatively breed at all? One reason is because of environmental variability. And so this is a bit of a complex figure, but what I want you to take away from this is that as variation in precipitation increases along the x-axis here. The number of cooperatively breeding species, these black dots, across the world tends to increase. And you can see that here, the mean of cooperatively breeding species is greater than non-cooperatively breeding species as variation in precipitation in a given area increases. So that variation is associated with cooperative breeding. And the same is true for variation in temperature. So the more variable the temperature is in a given region, the more instances of cooperative breeding are seen. And again, that's on a global scale. So again, why are birds social? I just want to recap everything that we've covered today. So birds are social to find food. They're social to avoid predators, to save energy, for example, in flight. They're social to obtain mates or to breed successfully. And they can also be social because they're predisposed to be social through traits like pair bonding, where males and females associate quite closely with one another, and through biparental care, where both males and females of a pair are required to help raise the young in order for that group of birds that nest to be successful. They are social because of the benefits in cooperative breeding associated with kin selection, like in the acorn woodpecker's helper at the nest system. And they're social cooperatively breeding overall, often because of environmental variability and unpredictability, a little bit of kin selection benefits. While the smooth-billed awnies are not habitat limited, other cooperatively breeding species might be, or the conditions might be so harsh associated with that environmental uncertainty and variability that by acting and living as a group, they can overall do better. So that wraps up a quick survey of sociality in birds. If you have any questions, please do get in touch. Again, my name is Leanne, and my email address is here at the bottom. It's grievell, Grievell @mcmaster.ca. And if any reason you want to get a hold of me or check me out on Twitter, I post a lot of bird photos and science. It's @leagrie, @LEAGRIE. So feel free to get in touch if you've got questions about the lecture. And I know you have regular office hours with Dr. Pruitt as well. So thank you for your time. And I apologize, I'm just figuring out how to stop recording.